Deborah Aschheim, who is the Hellman who has been the Hellman visiting artist at the Center for Memory and Aging in the Department of Neurology at the University of California, San Francisco, as well as being involved in many other residencies, teaching opportunities, exhibits, and so forth, is about to speak to us about some of her work, Thresholds of Significance, some art and science collaborations. Please welcome Deborah Aschheim.
So I'm going to show two videos at the end that take about 8 minutes. So if you could possibly, how long should I talk to start? 30 minutes. Okay. All right. So I was, as Joanna introduced, I was actually the inaugural Hellman visiting artist at the Memory and Aging Clinic, at the Memory and Aging Center at UCSF, which is right across the bay, and it's part of the neurology department. And they essentially they do very innovative and groundbreaking work with patients suffering from a range of generally age-related neurological disorders such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, and they're very, very well known for their work with frontotemporal dementia. And at the time and so I was the first in a series of visiting artists, and since me, they've had a musician and a poet, and they currently have an actor, and there's a funding for 10 years of people. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on my work, and then I'm going to tell you about some of the challenges and, I guess, hopefully successful outcomes of trying to be the first person to have a job that I wasn't exactly sure why there should be artists in the lab and the clinic, but I knew that I wanted there to be. So, so this is the background I'll give you is, so I first was in the Bay Area because I was artist in residence at Headland Center for the Arts, which is a beautiful artist colony in the national park that used to be a Navy base across the Golden Gate Bridge in Sausalito. And I was wrestling with the fact that numerous members of my family had been diagnosed with various kinds of neurological dementia. So my grandfather had what was considered to be Alzheimer's, and his brother and also my great aunt had all suffered from diseases that seemed to erase them and steal them from us. And I didn't really know how to deal with this. It was terrifying to me. So I decided. A lot of times my work comes out of things that give me anxiety, or that I kind of feel an obsessive desire to somehow engage with or solve. And I was thinking a lot about the fact that there's a phenomenon that psychologists identify called early childhood amnesia. That you guys have probably noticed this if you have kids or nephews or nieces, which is that children from the ages of 0 to 3 or 0 to 5, they clearly form memories. You can call them on the phone and talk to them. They can tell you about their experiences, but then it's very difficult to access these memories as an adult. And I personally was very interested we had an archive of family photos and home movies that all documented experiences that I couldn't remember. And I thought, well, I'm terrified by the idea of amnesia at the end of life, but kind of unconcerned about the fact that I can't remember these experiences. So maybe I'll spend some time with them to get a little bit more familiar with the idea. So I don't remember me and my sister hanging out along the Charles River, but it doesn't cause me distress. So I started working I was fortunate in the fact that my dad had an 8mm movie camera, and he got it, I guess, when he was dating my mom, and he filmed, their courtship, and literally every single thing I did as an infant, if I rolled over in the crib or even sat and did nothing. And then and then when my sister was born, he filmed a little, and my brother not so much. So luckily, I'm the one who is the artist. And so I was fascinated with these movies because they documented experiences that I didn't remember, but they perfectly replaced the period of early childhood amnesia. They were kind of like my prosthetic memories. And I found them incredibly mnemonic because even though I didn't remember the things that they depicted, I would have that Proustian time travel sense of, I remember my great-grandparents' house, and I remember how that cookie tasted, and I remember that smell. So this is a piece called June 10th, which is my birthday, and it's based on 3 different birthday parties that I don't remember when I was 1 and 3 and 5. And I would watch the movies over and over again, which are playing as tiny fragments. We might want to put the lights a little lower because the images are, the more we can see them, the better. Oh, really? Okay. Well, so anyways, you can't really tell, but there's tiny little film clips playing in the middle of these networks. And what I did was, it's not quite as literal as I'm going to say it, but it was pretty systematic. Those little glowing, like sort of LED-lit plastic blobs, where each one of them stood for something that I remembered when I was watching the movie. So it could be a person, a place, a thing. It could be those ice creams that we used to have that were half chocolate and half vanilla, and you ate them with a stick. It could be a piece of playground equipment, and I would map out these chains of associations, and that's what formed the sculptures. And I was very interested in the fact that you can look at the cellular structure of the brain, you can even look at molecules, but you can't really look at individual memories. And I was thinking about the fact that also memory might be less scary if it had a visual correlate. Like, for example, the internet. We kind of spatialize that. We talk about websites and chat rooms. We make it a geographical place so that it's not so unknowable. And so I figured if since we don't really know what the neural networks of memory look like, but that they are formed by these chains of associations, they might look like this. So this is my mom teaching me how to blow out the candles on my first birthday. And eventually these became large room-sized installations. I'll just show you one of them, but I did them for a while. This was at the Mattress Factory, which is this fantastic museum in Pittsburgh where they only show installation art, and they give you an entire floor and let you do whatever you want. So I took 14 of these little clips of early childhood experiences that aren't from my point of view, but sort of replace my missing memories. And I built these networks around them based on the shape of what the memories might look like. And at the center of the whole installation was by far my favorite movie that my father ever filmed. And I believe that he captured the classic Lacanian moment of the mirror stage. So this is the adorable infant me, and at this point I have no conception of the self. And so like the classic Lacanian infant, I think a baby has come over to play with me at our house. I'm very happy to see the baby. I try to kiss the baby. The female parent comes in, yeah? Oh, okay, sorry. My mother comes in and she says, "That's you." And I'm shocked and dismayed. Birth of the self. There was another part to this installation. I was also really concerned about the fact that my relatives that had dementia, it was becoming harder and harder for me to remember them when they were healthy. So at night, while I was working on my installation, I would call members of my family, and I would ask them to tell me stories to try to rebuild my sense of my relatives that had sort of been erased as their selves got erased, as their memories got erased. So this is my Aunt Dee Dee. And a lot of the, so what I did was I took some photographs of them and then excerpts that I printed out from the conversations, and I created this large wall drawing that was in sort of a transitional room that you went to before you got into the installation, rather than having a traditional didactic text that explained the installation. So you could read this and sort of get a sense of where it was coming from without it saying, Deborah Aschheim is an artist who has Alzheimer's in her family, or whatever it would have said. So my Aunt Dee Dee was an editor at Harvard. Her entire life was verbal and intellectual engagement. She never had children, and she wasn't interested in anything like that. So it was particularly distressing when she developed aphasia, and she lost her ability to create sentences. In the beginning, it was kind of painfully relatable. It was like when you forget the name of a film star or a word that you're looking for. But then eventually, she forgot all the words. So back at Headlands, we're going back into we're shifting around a little chronologically. I had been very interested in a phenomenon that neurologists talk about, and Oliver Sacks writes about it a lot in musicophilia, which is that people who sometimes lose their ability to remember words, either from dementia or a stroke, can still sometimes remember words that are embedded in song lyrics. And Headlands is a really neat artist colony. It has writers and musicians. And the very first night I met this brilliant musician, Lisa Mezzacappa, and I started telling her, I wish I could back up my brain the way I back up my hard drive. Once I said that I am very vigilant about that, and the thing came up on the screen during my talk that told me I hadn't backed up in 3 months, so I'm not going to say that today. But anyways, I do try, right? And I said, I'm worried about losing my memory for language, And I would really like, you're a musician, I'd really like to work with musicians to back up my memory for language as songs, because they found that people, like for example, I think it was Oliver Sacks, he says he had a patient that when she saw him in the morning, she couldn't say, "Good morning, Dr. Sacks," but she could still sing, "Good morning, good morning." So I said, wouldn't it be great if my favorite words were songs and I'd have them safely in an area of my brain that was less vulnerable, and if I lose my ability to speak, I'll express myself by singing. And Lisa said, that's an excellent idea. Why don't you write a list and bring me it in the morning? And this was the list. And so she brought a dozen or 15 talented Bay Area musicians out, and they wrote and recorded songs for my favorite words. So fast forward, I'm driving around LA, they're sending me these CDs, I'm trying to learn the songs, and they were so great that I was like, I have to build sculptures to play them. And one of the best parts of this project turned out to be just sort of the process itself, which was that I think there's probably nothing more personal about me. I feel more personally about this than my body or anything, than the way that I use language. But in order to hopefully preserve my language, I had to surrender its meaning to a group of strangers and let them reinterpret it and feed it back to me. So this is a sculpture for the word node. This wound up being a 2-channel piece. Nodes to me were connectivity in a network. They're those little glowing things that I hook up, right? But to the musicians who hadn't asked me about it, nodes stood for like lymph nodes and cancer metastasizing. And so this starts out as this very clean sound on either end of the musicians just singing the word node, and then it swells and distorts, and then it goes to a bunch of different kinds of speakers in the middle, and then it kind of calms down again. It became like a concrete embodiment of their meaning of the word. This is a sculpture this is a 4-channel piece for the word resonant, which they actually was such a great word for art and music and memory that they wound up making 3 different pieces that play in sequence as you move down from the wall to the floor. So all these sort of funnel shapes are speakers. They're just kind of stereos. If we had time, I'd play you the video for this. It's online, and it might be on my website, but some of these also wound up including, this is the white pieces for the word swoon, and then the blue is the word palimpsest, which wound up being an installation that not only was a 4-channel sound piece, but included a video slideshow of my grandfather's 1962 European vacation slides. So in another sort of irony, he was an avid amateur photographer, so the memories that he lost, I wound up inheriting in the form of digital memories. So this was the work I was doing when I met the people at the Memory and Aging Center, and we'll just fast forward to the part where they invited me to come be the visiting artist. And so the first thing I did, and so they said, what would you want to do as your project? And I said, I think I'd like to try to make a connection between the clinic and the lab, because one of the really neat things about their program is that they see patients, and they're also doing this cutting-edge research, but sometimes the two don't connect. And at the time, the MAC was also very dispersed. It was spread out all over San Francisco. So the first thing I drew was sort of like one of my networks, but it was all the researchers that I met with, because I spent a year basically going and seeing what every single person who was doing interesting work was doing and getting kind of like the world's best neurology medical education. And so this was actually the other Bill Seeley, not the one we have, teaching me. He said, I think it's important for you to see the disease cells. And I think as an artist, you'll understand immediately if you see a healthy cell versus a damaged neuron. And we sat under microscopes for 2 people and worked our way through the brain. And the second thing I did was I spent a lot of my time at UCSF going to Friday clinic, which is when people come in with symptoms. They meet with a team of doctors, and then everybody sits together and tries to figure out what might be wrong with them and what might be the therapy. When I exhibited, so this is just another narrative drawing that is little clusters of things that I remembered from different patients. When I exhibited this last time, somebody came up to me and said, I know what this is. It's an episode of House, right? And I was like, close, but not exactly. So this was somebody that had they had Lewy bodies, which is like a kind of Parkinson's, and it was fascinating to me that like various people that presented with these symptoms had the same kinds of hallucinations, even though they were radically different in terms of personality. But this was sort of their stories, and I started thinking like that. For me, even though I was enraptured with the research and seeing what was going on in the labs, one of the most important things that was changing for me was to develop this kind of empathy, to try to think about, what does it mean when these cognitive systems break down in terms of a person's life? So I started going to patients' homes to visit with them. This is somebody I actually met in clinic, but he was somebody who had a seizure disorder, and he could only get maybe like 5 or 10% of his memories into long-term memory. But he was incredibly smart. He was an engineer, and he had figured out ways to work around it. Like, for example, one day he lost his wallet, and he knew that if he tried to look for it, he would just keep searching the same room because he wouldn't remember. So he made a map of his apartment, and he took a Polaroid of every room that after he'd searched it, and he figured out that it was in his car. So I was trying to represent his world with all the memories that are missing, but a way of working around them. And Lisa, my musician friend, she came with me sometimes. So this was a patient that had frontotemporal dementia, the semantic variant, which meant she had lost her language. And she had a very small working vocabulary of maybe like 25 or 50 words, but the amount of meaning she was able to extract out of that was phenomenal to us. So I was trying to show her world, again, with the words sort of repeating and repeating, but creating these clusters of content. And then the last patient I made a portrait of was a woman who had cortical basal degeneration, and we visited her in her home also, and she had 20/20 vision, but her brain couldn't make sense of the images anymore. So she said when she tried to read, everything looked like it was in a foreign script. And her husband said, I wish you could make a drawing that would show me what she sees. And this was my attempt at that. So it's, again, the story of things that she told me, and then I just flipped it and reversed it to try to give a sense of the frustration of the information not coming together. So that wound up being one of the main things that I did was trying to understand and represent the patients as individual people and not just as patients and not just in the hospital and not just as their symptoms. The other thing I was interested in doing was I made a series of temporary installations for patient waiting areas and other places around the lab. I'm pretty interested in the idea of changing the culture of patient waiting areas, which doesn't necessarily seem to help people be prepared for the experience of the hospital that they're in or going to see the neurologist. And I was really interested in the fact that as a patient, you might be asked to be in a clinical trial, but you wouldn't really have a sense of the expanse of the data, the different projects that the researchers were working on to try to get some insight into the disease that you're suffering from. So there were people at UCSF, and they were doing eye tracking studies. One of the things that they were interested in was maybe some of these memory disorders resulted from the fact that patients with diseases paid attention differently than healthy people. And so if they weren't looking at the same things, they're probably not going to respond the same way in terms of what they remembered. So they were doing these eye tracking studies where they use an infrared camera to track where your eyes go. And sure enough, they found, like, for example, the healthy controls immediately go to the penguins, but the person with semantic dementia maybe didn't even look at the penguins. They're not going to remember the penguins when they're asked later. So we took these movies and we colorized the eye tracking cursor and we sped them up a little, and then I had different researchers from the clinic perform the patient's eye tracking. And this was a piece that you could look at while you're waiting to go see the neurologist, who's later going to say, can you follow my finger with your eyes, and help you maybe be prepared for the fact that the neurologists use eye tracking and eye movement as a way of measuring how your brain is working. The third thing that we did as part of my residency was we had access to these amazing brain imaging technologies, some of which people have been talking about today, fMRI and EEG. And so Lisa and I decided that we wanted to check in with our music and words project, which was actually called Earworms. It was named after it's a loan word from German that talks about, that's a name for music that gets stuck in your head over and over again, and you can't get it out. That's what we were trying to make with our project. And so we were wondering if it had actually worked. If I had different associations now with those words, or if it had somehow changed our thought processes. So we decided to do some experiments with postdocs and researchers at the Memory and Aging Center, like basically some brain scanning experiments using our own brains and using ourselves as the subject. And since then, I've had a lot of conversations with pretty hardline fMRI researchers that don't necessarily agree with using such reductive technology to answer such subjective and even complex philosophical questions. So So one of the very interesting things about doing these experiments was that they were very expensive in terms of time and to actually prepare them and to analyze the data. And they weren't science, and on their own, they also weren't art. So after my fellowship, which was 2009 to 2011, we spent an awfully long time wrestling with these and trying to figure out what they should be. And so so one of the experiments was we had them show us our songs, my sculptures that I built, our words mixed up with other random ones to see if they could see anything interesting in our brain activations. And then we also did some similar EEG experiments, but I also just had a strange visual image that I was in love with of Lisa playing her upright bass in the lab hooked up to 64 electrode EEG so that we could record her brain waves while we recorded her playing. It just came to me once, and I drew it in a notebook, and I always wanted to do it. So these were two things that we did, and I just wanted to mention one more thing before I show you the videos. So I'm going to show you what we ultimately wound up making out of this, and I don't have any sense of where we are on time, but oh, okay, so we're perfect. Okay. And so they're new pieces. They're kind of like, oh yeah, there's one more thing I'll show you quickly after this. But the thing I did want to mention is that I think one of the problems of artists in the lab, I think one of the important things that was great about this program was to actually just sort of serve as an agent of transparency, to go somewhere that many of us don't get to go, and to bring information back. But at the time, it was difficult to remember that was my job, because I was surrounded by all of these brilliant PhD people, and there's sort of an anthropological desire to sort of go native and to be one of them. And it was the hardest thing was to remember that I was an artist. I didn't have to be doing scientifically valid experiments. I didn't have to be advancing that kind of knowledge. I needed to be just bringing things back that people couldn't otherwise see. So the other final thing that's a result of my residency is 2 installations that I installed over at the new Sandler Center for Neuroscience in Mission Bay again, back to this idea of trying to change the culture of the waiting areas and to try to make the data and things that happen in the lab and the clinic more transparent. This one is actually a take on the idea of a donor wall. This is like a gratitude wall for somebody who helped fund the program. And this is over in the Memory and Aging Center. But this one probably was the one I'm the happiest about. It kind of grew out of the eye tracking experiment. On the monitor on the left is patients doing neurological exams and people participating in lots of different research projects, which range from virtual reality scenarios that help diagnose and treat wayfinding disorders, spatial cognition and people getting lost, mouse experiments with mice swimming through mazes, brain scanning, some things that they do over here at UC Berkeley that have to do with emotion regulation. And then in the monitor on the right is the data. And I feel like one of the things I've become really interested in is just showing people the data. Even when you read a paper, you just find out the results and you never get to see the experiment. And one of the most important things that I've learned and would love to be an agent of transparency for is for lay people being able to tell, what did they do in an experiment? How did they set it up? What was the variable? Did they actually prove the thing that they set out to prove? So I don't know if this does that in the waiting area. We used our own stuff too, but that was part of the goal. Okay, so now I'm gonna show you these videos and I'm gonna stop talking. So the first one is called Thresholds of Significance. It was based on wrestling with this fMRI data and trying to figure out what it meant and what we could do with it. And Indre Viskontas, who is the neuroscientist that was helping me and had set up the experiment, she was adjusting the thresholds of significance for the data, which basically meant, when you're talking about fMRI, the brain is incredibly active all the time. And so it's difficult to make the thing that you're looking at stand out. And if you set the threshold of significance too low, you don't see the thing you're looking for, and if you set it too high, I might have that backwards, then it looks more significant than it is. So I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm just going to show you. It's going to be out of time. And this is what we wound up doing with our EEG project. Okay.
What kind of reaction did the staff and patients have to the grading?
I don't really know because I made that in June and then I left for the rest of the summer. But while we were installing it, you know, people seemed really interested. There's somebody in the audience that could tell us more. Zach, this is Zach Miller and he's from the Memory and Aging Center. What have people said about it? I'm curious too.
Sure, I think the most important thing is you know, people are sort of engaging with the piece and asking us questions more about what we do. So, you know, I would otherwise be sort of nameless and faceless other than interacting with a research subject, performing a particular exam, and they would say, well, you know, what is this eye tracking experiment that's going on? How does that relate to what you're doing, a neurological exam on me today? And then I say, I'm glad you asked, and go into a long anecdote.
That's awesome. That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I'm noticing some superficial similarity to some of the hand tool patterns that you've created to some of the sort of algorithmically generated, sort of naturally evolving patterns from complex systems. Are you following that side of things? And do you have any feelings on that, sort of that spectrum from the personally created to the algorithmically generated?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in that. I don't know if I have an opinion about it, but I did do some stuff. I also did some art and science and fMRI experiments with the University of Pittsburgh. And we were looking at, they said, you know, they had funding. This is kind of before the crash. They had DARPA money, like a lot of other people that have mentioned why they were able to do things. And so I wanted to do something about worry, because I worry a lot. And so I actually made worry maps of the various subjects based on interviewing them about things that they worried about, and sort of spatialized those with the more intense, you know, more upsetting worries closer, and the less disturbing ones further away. And then we put people in the scanner, and we asked them to do things. We asked them to read normally through their worry map, to try to freak out as much as they could about the things that upset them, and to try not to worry. Because all my life people have said, don't worry, and I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do. And that was pretty interesting to do that and see what was going on in their brain. And it was pretty, you know, it was kind of obvious when I figured out when you tell people not to worry, they just go to the things on the map that they feel are not their fault, you know, that they can't fix. But, and actually, psychiatrists, my friend premiered it discussed it at NIH, and people wound up using it as a therapy, and they didn't care about the high-tech, sexy fMRI part that we thought was the cool part. But the really interesting thing was, so then some of my friend, Greg Siegel at University of Pittsburgh, his graduate students, I think, tried to make a computer program that could make the drawings the same as me, and they looked remarkably like my drawings, and it was only the the sort of rule-breaking, idiosyncratic, intuitive things that I do, thickening a line here or there, but as much as there was a rule that I could articulate, like, for example, in my work a lot, I borrow from the fMRI coding color strategy where you show brain activation as heat, so like when we were looking at fMRIs in a previous presentation, that red and orange, usually is like a lot of activation, and yellow is maybe medium, and blue is usually down activation, less activation than at rest or something. And so once I explained how I use colors, then they could put that in the system and the drawing. So we did sort of, somebody wrote a paper about it. We did have me try to make worry maps based on gathering information from people of like what are their worries and rating them from 1 to 10, and then had computers do the same thing, and they were remarkably similar except for a few idiosyncratic decisions that I made for aesthetic reasons. But then my friend Greg and I had a long argument about what's different between a person and a computer making work like that, in which he teased me for, he accused me of believing that people had souls, and we kind of didn't get any further with the conversation. That kind of shut it down. Those are fighting words, but...
All right, maybe souls is a good place to end.
Yeah.